56 years. That is how long a man sat inside the life of a small Ontario lakeside town and was trusted with it completely. 56 years of sitting in the same booth at the same diner on Friday mornings, of waving to the same neighbors across the same driveways, of watching the same lake change through the same seasons outside the window of a house he had lived in since before the crime. He had been 22 years old when it happened. He was 78 when the OPP came to his door. In between, a woman named Evelyn Rose Chartrand had waited 56 years for her name to be spoken in a courtroom in connection with the man who had taken her life. Her daughter, Marguerite, had waited 56 years. Marguerite had been 4 years old when her mother didn't come home. She was 60 years old on the morning of the arrest, sitting in the kitchen of a house in Sudbury, Ontario, when her phone rang and a voice she did not know told her that they had him. She said later that she sat at the kitchen table for a very long time after the call. She said the lake light was coming through the window. She had moved to a house near water, though she could not always explain why, and she sat with the light and the phone in her hand, and thought about what it meant that the answer was a man who had been in plain sight for 56 years, and that the thing that finally found him was a technology that had not existed when her mother was alive. But to understand what that technology found and what it cost for it to take this long, you have to go back to the summer of 1968, and you have to understand who Evelyn Rose Chartrand was before any of this happened to her. Sturgeon Falls sits on the north shore of Lake Nipissing in northeastern Ontario, where the French River drains west toward Georgian Bay, and the Canadian Shield presses up through the soil in great shelves of pink granite. In 1968, it was a pulp and paper mill town, about 5,000 people. French and English in roughly equal proportion, the kind of bilingual community that had been navigating that particular balance for a century and had developed, from the friction of it, a resilience that outsiders sometimes mistook for stoicism. The mill was the town's heartbeat. The lake was its soul. In summer, the water turned that particular shade of northern blue that exists nowhere else, and the families who had lived there for 3 or 4 generations fished the same bays their grandparents had fished, and knew which rocks to avoid, and knew each other. Evelyn Chartrand was 31 years old that summer. She had grown up in Sturgeon Falls, the daughter of a mill worker, had married young and well, and then lost her husband, Robert, to a workplace accident at the mill in 1965, when Marguerite was barely a year old. She had stayed. Some people left after loss, went to Sudbury or North Bay or further south, but Evelyn stayed because her parents were here, and the town was hers, and she was not the kind of woman who ran from the shape of her own life. She worked at the post office on King Street, had for 4 years, and everyone who came through that door knew her by first name, and she knew theirs. She sorted mail with an efficiency that her postmaster called the best he had seen in 20 years, and she did it with the particular warmth of someone who understands that a small town's post office is not just a place where envelopes change hands, but a place where the community keeps track of itself. She had a garden, tomatoes and beans mostly, with marigolds along the border to keep the deer out. She grew enough that she gave produce away through the end of August. She had a radio in the kitchen that she listened to while she cooked, the CBC usually, or French pop music that her mother had raised her on, and that Marguerite would fall asleep to on the kitchen floor while Evelyn made supper. She was saving up. Not for anything specific, not yet. Just the discipline of it. The small weekly amount that was building toward something she hadn't named but could almost see. A trip south in the winter, maybe. A better stove. Options. The comfort of knowing that she had more than what 1 week's wages covered. She had a laugh that her friend Lorraine Desrochers described 50 years later as the kind of laugh that made you feel like whatever you had just said was the most worthwhile thing you'd said all week. On the evening of Friday, the 5th of July, 1968, Evelyn left her parents' house on Maple Street at approximately 9:15 p.m. after dropping Marguerite for the night. It was a warm evening, not hot, but the kind of comfortable summer warmth that makes a July night in northern Ontario feel like a gift. She was walking home. The distance was just over a kilometer, along a route she had walked hundreds of times, past the hardware store and the Legion Hall and the edge of the park that ran along the water. She had done this walk in every season. She knew every crack in the sidewalk. She never made it home. Her neighbor, a retired schoolteacher named Giselle Tremblay, noticed the light in Evelyn's kitchen was not on at 10. Giselle waited. At 10:30, she knocked. At 11, she called Evelyn's mother, Pauline. By midnight, Pauline was on the phone to the Ontario Provincial Police. The search began at dawn on the 6th of July and ran for 4 days through the park, the waterfront, and the bush on the town's eastern edge. On the 9th of July, 1968, an OPP search team found Evelyn Chartrand at the edge of a stand of white birch in the park, 60 meters from the path she would have taken home. She had been there since the night of the 5th. The cause of death was manual strangulation. She was 31 years old. The OPP investigation was led by Detective Sergeant Maurice Lapointe, 44 years old, out of the North Bay Detachment. He was a careful, unhurried investigator in the mold of men who believed that enough patience applied to enough evidence would always produce an answer. He spoke both French and English, which mattered in Sturgeon Falls, where the investigation required moving between communities that did not always move easily between each other. He interviewed more than 200 people in the first 2 months. He cataloged physical evidence from the scene, including biological material, and stored it under the procedures of the day, which were rigorous for 1968, and which would, as it turned out, be rigorous enough. Lapointe identified 3 persons of interest in the first month. He eliminated 2 within the year. The third was a 22-year-old man named Gaston Vaillancourt, the son of a mill foreman, known to the town, known vaguely to Evelyn through the overlapping social geography of a 5,000-person community. Vaillancourt had been seen near the park on the evening of the 5th. He said he had been walking. He said he did not see Evelyn. He had no firm alibi for the window between 9 and 11 p.m., but he also had nothing beyond presence at proximity, nothing that met the evidentiary standard a 1968 investigation required to move forward. Lapointe interviewed Vaillancourt 3 times. He documented his suspicion in language that was careful and precise, and that his successors, reading it decades later, would understand immediately. He could not prove it. In 1968, without the technology to say what the biological evidence from the scene said, he could not prove it. The active investigation was formally suspended in 1971. Maurice Lapointe retired from the OPP in 1984. He died in 1997. The case file, his interview notes, his carefully documented suspicions about Gaston Vaillancourt, all of it remained in the OPP archive. The biological evidence remained in storage. Gaston Vaillancourt stayed in Sturgeon Falls. He married in 1972. He had 3 children. He worked in mill management for 20 years, then ran a small boat repair operation on the lake. He was at the community hall for the centennial celebrations in 1982. He was at the funerals of people he had known his entire life. He sat in the Friday morning booth at the diner, and he waved across driveways, and he watched the lake through every season from the window of the house he had bought in 1975, 2 blocks from the park where Evelyn Chartrand had been found. 2 blocks. Marguerite Chartrand grew up knowing almost nothing about the circumstances of her mother's death, and almost everything about her mother. Pauline, Evelyn's mother, Marguerite's grandmother, had raised her with extraordinary care and had made a deliberate decision, which she revisited every few years and never reversed, that Marguerite would know who Evelyn was before she learned how Evelyn died. That the person would come before the crime, that her mother would not be reduced to a case file. So Marguerite knew about the marigolds along the garden border and the CBC radio and the French pop music and the laugh that made people feel worthwhile. She knew her mother had been saving up for something she hadn't named yet. She knew her mother had walked home from her parents' house on Maple Street on a warm July evening because she had walked it hundreds of times and knew every crack in the sidewalk. Marguerite moved to Sudbury as a young adult. She trained as a nurse. She married, had 2 children of her own, built a life at a careful distance from Sturgeon Falls, not an estranged distance, but the kind of distance you build when a place holds something too large to be near every day. She came back for Christmas and for her grandmother Pauline's birthday every year until Pauline died in 2003. After that, she came back less. Every year on the 5th of July, she lit a candle. She lit 38 of them before the OPP Cold Case Unit formally reopened the Chartrand case in 2006. She lit 46 of them before the first DNA submission, in 2014, came back inconclusive. She lit 54 of them before a forensic genealogist named Dr. Adayeze Obi joined the OPP's newly expanded investigative genetic genealogy program in early 2023. She lit 55 of them alone. Every case we cover on this channel is built carefully from public records, archived reporting, and documented sources, because Evelyn Chartrand has waited 56 years for her story to be told accurately, and Marguerite has waited just as long. If that care matters to you, please subscribe and leave a like. Tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Now let's get back to Evelyn. Dr. Adayeze Obi had a background that made her, by training and temperament, precisely the right person for the work she was now doing. She held a doctorate in human genetics from the University of Toronto and had spent 8 years doing genealogical research before transitioning to forensic applications in 2020, drawn, she said in a 2022 interview with a Canadian forensic science journal, by the particular satisfaction of work that moved in only one direction, toward a name. The Chartrand biological evidence was resubmitted for analysis in January of 2023 using low-template DNA extraction methods that had not existed during the 2014 attempt. The evidence was old, 55 years old, and the odds of recovering a viable profile from material of that age were not certain. But the storage conditions had been stable. The OPP's evidence preservation protocols, updated in the 1990s, had kept the kit in temperature-controlled conditions that matched what the original collection procedures had established in 1968. The profile came back in April of 2023. Male, complete, viable. Dr. Obi uploaded it to GEDmatch and to Family Tree DNA, 2 of the largest publicly accessible genealogical databases, on the 17th of April. She began building family trees outward from the partial matches that came back. The process required cross-referencing Canadian census records, Quebec and Ontario birth and death registrations, parish records from the Francophone communities of northeastern Ontario, and family trees that branched across the border into Quebec. It was slower than some cases. The northeastern Ontario Francophone community of the 1940s and 1950s had not, on the whole, been as enthusiastic early adopters of consumer ancestry testing as some other demographics. But the database was wide enough. By mid-June, after 8 weeks of methodical work, Dr. Obi had narrowed the field to a single family line in Sturgeon Falls, Ontario. two male candidates of approximately the right age. One had died in 2019. The other was 77 years old and living in Sturgeon Falls. His name was Gaston Vaillancourt. Dr. Obi pulled the case file. She found Maurice Lapointe's interview notes, 3 separate interviews, 1968 and 1969, language precise and careful, suspicion clearly documented in every line, conclusion the same each time, insufficient evidence to proceed. She read them slowly. Then she called the OPP Cold Case Unit coordinator and said, "The detective knew. He knew in 1968. A reference sample from Vaillancourt was obtained covertly, a water bottle discarded at a public location near his home in October of 2023, recovered by OPP investigators and submitted for comparison. The match to the crime scene profile was confirmed on the 3rd of November, 2023. The comparison was unambiguous. The biological material collected from the scene by Maurice Lapointe in July of 1968 matched, without any margin for reasonable doubt, the man Lapointe had interviewed 3 times and been forced to release 55 years before. On the morning of the 14th of February 2024, 56 years and 7 months after Evelyn Rose Chartrand failed to come home from her parents' house on Maple Street, OPP officers drove to the house 2 blocks from the park on the lake and knocked on the door. Gaston Vaillancourt was 78 years old. He answered the door himself. He was dressed. He looked at the officers for a long moment, a long, specific moment that one of the officers present described afterward as the look of a man watching something arrive that he had known was coming for a very long time, without knowing when it would get there. And then he said nothing. He made no sound. He turned and looked back into his house, at the lake visible through the kitchen window, at the water and the light. And then he turned back and held out his wrists. He was taken from the house in handcuffs at 8:22 a.m. on a February morning. He did not speak. The news reached Sturgeon Falls by mid-morning. It moved through the diner and the post office on King Street and the boat repair yards on the waterfront and the Friday morning regulars who had been sharing a booth with Gaston Vaillancourt for decades. The word that came back from every direction was the same word: stunned. People who had known him for 60 years. People who had trusted him with their boats and their Friday mornings and their community hall evenings. People who had, in some cases, been children in 1968 and remembered the summer Evelyn Chartrand was found at the edge of the birch stand in the park, and who had never, in all the years since, connected that memory to the man sitting across the table from them. The OPP confirmed the arrest and the charge publicly on the 15th of February. Marguerite Chartrand's phone rang before 8 a.m. She was in her kitchen in Sudbury. The lake light was coming through the window. She sat at the table for a very long time. She flew to North Bay that afternoon. She did not go to Sturgeon Falls. She was not ready for that, not yet. She met with the OPP investigators and the Crown prosecutor, and she sat across a table from people who could finally tell her that they had the man, and that the evidence was strong and that the case would be prosecuted with everything available. She said she wanted to understand what had taken 56 years. Not as an accusation, she said. She understood that in 1968 the technology did not exist. She understood that Detective Lapointe had done his job with what he had. She had read Lapointe's notes by then. The OPP had shared them with her, and she said that reading them had been like hearing someone knock on a door and not be able to open it over and over for 55 years. He had known. He had simply had no key. Gaston Vaillancourt was charged with first-degree murder in March of 2024. He entered a plea of not guilty. He was released on bail, an outcome that Marguerite said she found difficult, but that she understood as part of a process she had waited long enough to see completed correctly. At the time of this recording, proceedings are ongoing and the trial date has been set for the autumn of 2025. The biological evidence collected by Maurice Lapointe in July of 1968, stored, transferred, repackaged, and preserved across 56 years through 4 different OPP evidence facilities, is expected to be the definitive element of the prosecution's case. It survived a Northern Ontario summer, 56 winters, 2 inconclusive analysis attempts, and the deaths of both the detective who collected it and the woman whose grandmother wrote letters to the OPP every 5th of July for 30 years, asking when it would be used. That grandmother was Pauline, Evelyn's mother. She stopped writing when arthritis made it impossible, not before. Evelyn Rose Chartrand was 31 years old. She grew up in a mill town on a blue lake in northeastern Ontario and stayed when staying was hard, because it was hers. She sorted mail on King Street and grew tomatoes and marigolds and fed her daughter on the kitchen floor to French pop music from the radio. She had a laugh that made people feel like whatever they said was worthwhile. She was saving up for something she hadn't named yet: a winter trip south, a better stove, options, the comfort of forward motion. She was walking home on a warm July evening along a route she knew by heart, and she knew every crack in the sidewalk, and she did not make it home. 56 years later, a DNA profile extracted from evidence that a detective collected in 1968 with the technology of 1968 and the instincts of a man who knew, even then, who had done it, that profile matched a name. The same name. The name Maurice Lapointe had written in his notebook in the summer of 1968 and been forced to put down without the key to open what he knew. The key took 56 years to exist. The evidence was patient enough to wait for it. Think about Pauline, Evelyn's mother, Marguerite's grandmother, writing letters to the OPP every 5th of July for 30 years, asking when the evidence would be used, until arthritis made it impossible. What do you make of a family that sustains that kind of faith in a system that took 56 years to deliver? And what do you make of Maurice Lapointe, a detective who documented his suspicion with precision in 1968 and died in 1997 with the case unsolved, and whose notes were the first thing Dr. Obi called the coordinator about when the database returned the match? He knew. He simply had no key. Does this case change how you think about cold case evidence preservation? About what it means to collect evidence carefully in 1968 for a technology that won't exist for another 50 years? Leave your answers below. We want to know what you think. And tell us, is 56 years too long for justice to still be called justice? Or is justice measured differently when the alternative is nothing at all? Justice is still being sought for Evelyn Rose Chartrand. She waited 56 years, and Marguerite waited with her, and Pauline wrote 30 years of letters until she couldn't hold a pen. Stories like Evelyn's are why this channel exists, because the evidence that survives is only as useful as the people willing to keep asking the question. If you believe that, subscribe. More cases are waiting in the description. Thank you for watching for Evelyn, and for Marguerite, and for Pauline.